The only place where we've seen unemployment move in the opposite direction and employment actually grow is in government. It's now the largest employer across the country. The U.S. federal government and state employees dominate the employment landscape, and the average compensation for a federal employee is now $70,000 compared to the average private sector employee at about $49,000. The difference is immense, and in the midst of major economic contraction, we continue to see year after year increases in pay at the federal level. This does not reflect the reality that we're in, and I think will ultimately be something that the public responds to with pitchforks.
There's basically two different constituents here in the United States, the politically connected and those that aren't. In other parts of the world, being politically connected means you get to survive and thrive. If you're not politically connected, you're doomed.
This is where I think we need to push back as citizens. There's control over money, there's control over medicine, there's control over food, there's control over virtually every area of our lives. And that assumes that our leadership is benign. That may be the case, but in history that's not always been the case. And the degree of control that we have ceded to government and the assumption that it will remain benign, I think is at best naive.
Probably the greatest thing that we could do as a country would be to shut down the Federal Reserve. Without access to unlimited amounts of money, we would see a natural shrinkage in the size of government. Our legislature couldn't promise all that they do because there'd be a natural restraint. You might in fact have the same kinds of benefits not having the Federal Reserve System as we had under the gold standard. Politicians were tempered.
If we are effectively making the case that the Federal Reserve is vital to the functioning of government and vital to the functioning of Wall Street, I think it's important that you do your own homework. Your first action step in terms of understanding the Fed is to read the Federal Reserve Act. That's easy enough. You can follow the link on our website to that. The second thing you can do is download the special report we did, an interview with G. Edward Griffin, who wrote a book on the Federal Reserve, gave a thorough summary of its inception, why it was created, what it's been used for. It's easy to try to draw parallels between the end of this empire, the American Empire, and that of the British or of the Roman. Look at characteristics that may accompany a state as it is in the process of failing. If it's not at an inflection point of failure, but nearing the cusp, it's important to know what those characteristics might look like.
I spoke with Paul Craig Roberts this last year, and we discussed the 8 characteristics of a failed state.
The first characteristic was that the national budget has to be financed by foreigners.
The second characteristic of a failed state is that you're too politically weak to advance your interests through diplomacy and thus depend on military coercion. The third characteristic of a failed state is when your costs are out of control and your limited resources begin to be funneled to special interest groups at the expense of the citizenry. The fourth characteristic of a failed state is when the dominant political parties are on the take from corporate lobby groups and special interests.
The fifth characteristic of the failed state is that our currency is dying as a result of too much debt and money printing.
The sixth characteristic is when industrial production collapses, which it already has. The seventh characteristic, according to Paul Craig Roberts, is when regulatory bodies and regulatory agencies have been corrupted by private influence.
The eighth characteristic of a failed state is that the police is militarized.